Problems of the GIT: hyperbile, hematologic, sepsis, surgical abdomen dysmorphology. So for the GIT, okay, let me clear my, yeah, okay, there you go. Okay. So signs and symptoms suggestive of GI pathology in the newborn may reflect immaturity of the gut or disorder specific to the GIT or a systemic disease affecting the GI tract as part of a multi-system disorder. So very important you have a good history and physical examination. So let's start with the case. So this is a 24-weeker. Okay, so this is a 24-weeker born 24 preterm AGA baby girl with a relatively unremarkable course in the NICU. However, the 4 weeks of life tolerating full feedings developed suddenly abdominal distension. Feeds were stopped and abdominal X-ray shows. Then antibiotics were given and no surgical intervention was required. Then baby recovered. So what is the commonest sequelae that needs to be observed for in the following up in the follow-up? So first, what is this case? This is case of what do you think so? What do you think? This is a case of necrotizing enterocolitis. You're correct, Paolo. So what is neck? What's happening? Okay, neck is necrotizing enterocolitis. It is the most common life-threatening emergency of the GIT in the newborn period. So this disease is characterized by various decrease of mucosal or transmural necrosis of the intestine. So the cause of neck remains unclear. However, it most likely be multifactorial as you see in this slide. So the incidence is 5 to 10% among infants with birth weight of less than 1,500 grams, with mortality rate of 20 to 30% of those affected and approaching 50% in infants who would require surgery. So many factors contribute to the development of the pathologic findings of neck, which includes mucosal ischemia and subsequent necrosis with gas accumulation in the mucosa, in the submucosa of the bowel wall, and we call this as pneumatosis intestinalis, and progression of necrosis to perforation, peritonitis, sepsis, or even death. So the distal part of the ileum and the proximal segment of the column are the most involved part of the intestine. This is because this is our the watershed areas. So in fatal cases, gangrene may extend from the stomach to the rectum. So we know we call this as neck totalis. So there are three major risk factors that have been implicated or identified. So first would be prematurity, followed by bacterial colonization of the gut and formula feeding. So neck develops primarily in premature infants with exposure to metabolic substrate. So in the context of a development or immature intestinal mucosa, followed by microbial as dysbiosis, and then this will cause mucosal ischemia. So an underlying genetic predisposition is being recognized with variants in genes regulating immunomodulation and inflammation. This is example of this is the toll-like receptor 4 or interleukin 6. Also apoptosis and repair, such as caused by platelet activating factor and oxidant stress. So what are these culprits? So the vascular endothelial growth factor, arginine, and nitric oxide. So the greatest risk factor for neck though is still prematurity. So although nearly 90% of all cases of neck occur in preterm infants, that disease can occur also in full term. So in term, it is often a secondary disease seen more frequently in patients with history of birth asphyxia or Down syndrome, congenital heart disease, even rotavirus infection, and Hirschsprung's disease. So infants with neck have a variety of signs and symptoms and may have an insidious or sudden catastrophic onset. So the onset of neck is usually in the second or third week of life, but can also as late as the third month in the very low birth weight. For the term infant, it happens during the first week of life. That's the difference, actually. The age of onset is inversely related to gestational age, meaning the smaller the baby, the higher the incidence of neck. So the first sign of impending disease may be non-specific, including lethargy and temperature instability, or related to gastrointestinal pathology, such as abdominal distension and gastric retention. Hence, a very high index of suspicion in treating preterm at risk is very crucial. So we use the modified Bell's criteria, as you see in this slide, in diagnosing the different stages of neck, which utilize clinical signs and radiographic findings, and the management would depend on the corresponding stage. Now, how do we diagnose? So actually, we only need a plain radiographic abdominal radiograph to make the diagnosis. So the findings of pneumatosis intestinalis or air in the bowel mucosa confirms the clinical suspicion of neck and is diagnostic. So based on the Bell's criteria, you see that presence of pneumatosis is stage 2A. Okay, for stage 1 or suspect, the next suspect, we only have non-specific signs and symptoms plus could be a normal abdomen or ileus. For stage 2A, presence of pneumatosis intestinalis. For 2B, presence of portal gas with or without ascites. So, ano yung portal gas? So, let's go back to our second slide. So, for neck 1, pneumatosis intestinalis, as you can see in this X-ray, there is thickening of the bowel mucosa with parang thumb track appearance, para siyang what do you call that? Para siyang train, parang siya, it's air in the mucosa, in the submucosa. However, for stage 2 naman, so this is actually diagnostic na. So stage 2, 50% of patient would have, for pneumatosis intestinalis, 50%, at least 50 to 75% would have a positive X-ray, and treatment should be treated outrightly. So for stage 2B naman, this is presence of portal gas in the portal gas. So here you see portal gas here. So that would be stage 2B. So there is appropriate corresponding duration for the NPO. And for stage 3 naman, this is the most severe. So 3B, presence of pneumoperitoneum, which indicates bowel perforation. So here you see we call this the football sign. Okay, for hepatic sonography may detect portal venous gas in some patients with normal abdominal X-ray. So if if the patient is clinically you're clinically thinking of neck, then if you don't see any in the X-ray, then you can have an ultrasound. So outcome, it's high mortality and morbidity, such as small gut syndrome if surgery resection is done, and if not, presence of stricture later on. So that's the answer, presence of stricture if medically treated. So going back to this modified Bell's criteria, if it's stage 1, yun nga, presence of pneumatosis, we only place the patient on NPO for at least 7 days. For stage 2B, those with portal gas, at least 14 days of NPO. 7 days of NPO, 14 days of treatment. So we can we place this patient on NPO for at least 3 to 7 days, depending on the improvement of the mucosa, depending on the of the bowel, depending on the improvement of the X-ray. All right, now we move on to meconium diseases. So the term meconium disease refers to meconium ileus and meconium plug syndrome. So these conditions are considered separately from functional or anatomic causes of neonatal obstruction, such as Hirschsprung's disease or intestinal atresia, and any rectal malformations. Meconium plug is because of functional immaturity of the colon with delayed passage of meconium, and this is usually transient. It is a benign variation of Hirschsprung's disease, though in some instances, and typically presents with abdominal distension and bullous emesis. So plain X-ray shows multiple dilated loops of bowels and no rectal gas, as you see in this X-ray. How about ileus? 90% of patients with meconium ileus have cystic fibrosis. So it presents with a bilious vomiting, abdominal distension, and no passage of meconium, and this usually involves the distal ileum. X-ray would show abdominal distended intestinal loops without air fluid level and can appear granular or bubbly because of the meconium because of the meconium. So anemia is successful in 60%. So peritonitis on the other hand is intestinal perforation with meconium spillage into the peritoneal cavity. This happen in utero. So frequently the intestinal perforation seals naturally with relatively little meconium leakage into the peritoneal cavity. Or it can require surgery if there is a sign of obstruction or persistent peritonitis and sepsis or presence of abdominal mass. As you see in this X-ray, actually, there's a huge abdominal mass here. So perforations can occur mostly often as a complication of meconium ileus in infants with cystic fibrosis, but occasionally result from a meconium plug or in utero obstruction of another cause, such as intestinal obstruction, atresia, volvulus, or gastroschisis. Now, what is hyperbilirubinemia? So jaundice is a common manifestation among newborns. Actually, this is the second most common reason for admission. So during the neonatal period, first is respiratory distress. So unlike adults in whom it is clinically detectable with a serum bilirubin of more than 2 milligram per deciliter, in neonates it is apparent only when serum bilirubin is more than 5 milligram per deciliter. Approximately, it is encountered in about 60% of term infants and 80% of the preterm infants. This is due to the immaturity of the liver. In most cases, jaundice in newborn is benign. However, significant jaundice occur in 6% of term infants. So it usually appears during the early neonatal period, depending on etiology. So whereas jaundice from the position of indirect bilirubin in the skin tends to appear yellow, bright yellow, or orange, jaundice of the obstructive type, which we call the direct bilirubin, has a greenish or muddy yellow cast. So that's how we differentiate the type of jaundice. Even if we don't have a clinical we don't have a serum bilirubin level yet, we can actually determine through clinical findings if this is actually an indirect type or a direct hyperbilirubinemia. So usually jaundice becomes apparent in the cephalocaudal progression starting from the head, the face, actually progressing to the abdomen, trunk, abdomen, then to the feet. So as serum level increases. So there are different clinical methods to detect neonatal jaundice as you see in this slide. First is blanching. So blanching of the skin. So where we do it at the tip of the nose, sternum, abdomen, palms, and soles with digital pressure. So in accordance with the Kramer guidelines, we see in this figure, it is based on observation that neonatal jaundice progresses in cephalocaudal direction. So a rough estimate of bilirubin level can be made as follows. So 5 on the face, if jaundice 5 milligram is just on the face, then upper chest and upper abdomen is about 10. Then as you go down, it's about 12. Then if it's involved the legs and the upper arm, it's about 15. And if it involves palms and the soles, more than 15. So this is not actually accurate. But still, you get to have a serum level. But this can be used if you are practicing in remote areas wherein access to diagnostic procedure is a challenge. What about icterometer? Icterometer, it's a non-invasive method which is more accurate and less subjective. So the tool is used as a transparent plastic with five graded, you see here, five graded yellow stripes of different shades corresponding to the serum bilirubin level. It is pressed against the tip of the nose. In cases of dark skin, gums may be a better option. So the color of the skin is matched with the yellow stripes obtained bilirubin level. For the third parang third type of third method, we use the transcutaneous bilirubinometer. So here. So this is more accurate and more objective, so but expensive. It's just actually about 300 to 500, no, yung isang machine lang yan. It measures the total serum bilirubin employing a photo probe. So a photo probe is pressed against the skin of the forehead and the sternum. So we get the forehead, then the sternum, then you compare it. Then following analysis by the computerized spectrophotometer, a digital display of bilirubin level is actually immediately made. So you see the level immediately. Okay. So how is bilirubin metabolized? It is the end product of catabolism of heme derived primarily from the breakdown of the RBC. See here. So this is the major heme-containing protein and accounts for 80 to 90% of the bilirubin production. So the rate-limiting step in this production is the oxidation of heme to form a green pigment called biliverdin, a process controlled by the enzyme heme oxygenate. Other sources of heme-containing proteins such as myoglobin, cytochrome, and nitric oxide synthase are identified. Microsomal enzyme known as heme oxygenase located in the liver, spleen, and nucleated RBCs oxidize heme ring from the heme containing proteins to biliverdin and to carbon monoxide. Then the enzyme biliverdin reductase reduces biliverdin to bilirubin. So unsaturated bilirubin is produced at this point, and it is nonpolar and insoluble in water. Thus, it needs serum albumin to be transported to the liver. So bilirubin exists in several forms in the blood, but is predominantly bound to serum albumin. So elevated concentration of free unconjugated bilirubin, meaning hindi siya bound sa albumin, it can enter the CNS and is neurotoxic. So inside the liver, unconjugated bilirubin is bound immediately to intracellular proteins, which is the most important one being ligandin. So it is then converted into an excretable and soluble form through the process of conjugation that consists of transfer of one or two glucuronic acid residues from uridine diphosphoglucuronic acid to form a monoglucuronamide or diglucuronamide. So uridine diphosphoglyceronyl transferase or UDPGT is the major enzyme involved in this process. Now, conjugated bilirubin is now water soluble and can be excreted in the urine, but most of it is rapidly excreted as bile into the intestine. So conjugated bilirubin is further metabolized by bacteria in the intestine and excreted in the feces. So, however, conjugated bilirubin is not reabsorbed in the bowel unless it is deconjugated by the intestinal enzyme beta-glucuronidase present in the unital intestinal mucosa. Resorption of bilirubin from the GI tract and delivery to the liver for reconjugation is called intrahepatic circulation. So intestinal bacteria can prevent intrahepatic circulation of bilirubin by reducing conjugated bilirubin to urobilin, which is not a substrate for beta-glucuronidase. And then eventually, it will be excreted into the feces or into the urine, urobilinogen. Okay, so the distinction between physiologic and pathologic jaundice are related to the timing, rate of rise, and extent of hyperbilirubinemia, because some of the physiologic causes, such as large RBC masses or decreased capacity for bilirubin conjugation or increased intrahepatic circulation, can also result to pathologic jaundice. So evaluation should be determined on the basis of risk factors, clinical appearance, and severity of the bilirubin or the hyperbilirubinemia. So jaundice that is present at birth or appears within the first 24 hours after birth should be considered pathologic and requires immediate attention. Potential diagnosis would include erythroblastosis fetalis or concealed hemorrhage, or even sepsis or congenital infection, such as torch infection. Hemolysis is suggested by a rapid rise in serum bilirubin concentration of about more than 0.5 milligram per deciliter per hour, presence of anemia, pallor, reticulocytosis, hepatosplenomegaly, and a positive family history. Jaundice that appears on the second or third day is usually physiologic, but may present a more severe form. So familial non-hemolytic icterus, such as Crigler-Najjar syndrome and early onset breastfeeding jaundice are seen initially on the second or third day of life. So jaundice appearing after the third day and within the first week, such as bacterial sepsis or UTI, or it may suggest a congenital infection. Now, the unconjugated bilirubin, which is designated as indirect act, we differentiate conjugated and conjugated. So, unconjugated is designated indirectly acting by nature of the Vandenberg reaction, is the end product of heme protein catabolism from a series of enzymatic reaction by heme oxygenase, as we have discussed, and biliverdin reductase and enzymatic reducing agents in the reticulum endothelial cells. So it is a fat soluble. Conjugated bilirubin are known as the direct reacting. So when we get the total serum bilirubin, then they get the direct um bilirubin, or the yes, so that will be your conjugated bilirubin. So it is a polar water soluble glucuronide of bilirubin. Although bilirubin may have a physiologic role as an antioxidant, elevation of indirect conjugated bilirubin are potentially neurotoxic, since it can cause the blood-brain barrier, as we've discussed early. So even though the conjugated form is non-neurotoxic, since it can cause the BBB, direct hyperbilirubinemia indicates potentially serious hepatic disorders or systemic illness. Hence, it is always pathologic. So, why is it direct? Kasi yun lang yung nagre-react dun sa reaction. Then, ima-minus mo yung direct level na nakuha sa total serum bilirubin. So, that would be the indirect level. So now, what are the mechanisms of pathologic jaundice? First is to know what type of hyperbilirubinemia are we dealing with, whether this is unconjugated or conjugated, after which you can determine the possible causes of jaundice. So unconjugated hyperbil can either be secondary to a prehepatic form, as you see here. So or secondary to increased RBC breakdown or impaired um uptake in the liver, or hepatic so can either be prehepatic due to overproduction or impaired hepatic uptake. Or it could be hepatic here, second level. So due to decreased conjugation, while conjugated bilirubin is always post-hepatic due to decreased excretion that is from an intrahepatic or an extrahepatic obstruction. So on the right side of the screen, you see that the various differential diagnoses causing this type of hyperbilirubinemia. So hemolytic disease is the most common cause of hyperbilirubinemia. So what type of hemolytic disease? So usually it is secondary to prehepatic, di ba? Prehepatic siya. So before siya, overproduction kasi siya. Increased production, increased hemolysis. So non-hemolytic causes can be due to infection, cephal hematoma, or exaggerated physiologic jaundice, or due to polycythemia. So increased RBC load. So decreased hepatic uptake can either be due to decreased plasma albumin or problem in the liver transfer protein, such as ligandin. So it can also be due to inefficient uptake of bilirubin by hepatocytes from reduced hepatic blood flows like NCHF or congestive heart failure, or portosystemic shunts. Or there can be certain drugs that competitively bind with bilirubin, binding sites on albumin, thus displacing the bilirubin, increasing the amount of free bilirubin. So what are these drugs? Example of which, aspirin, sulfonamide, penicillin, and gentamicin. So in Rotor syndrome, or The glutathione S transferase is a carrier protein that assists the bilirubin uptake into the cytosol and may be implicated in this condition. Actually, Rotor syndrome is discovered by a Filipino scientist, Filipino doctor. Inherited defects in the gene that encodes the UGT1, which catalyze the conjugation of bilirubin with glucuronic acid, decrease bilirubin conjugation. This reduces hepatic bilirubin clearance and increase total serum or plasma bilirubin level. So there are three known types. First, the Crigler-Najjar syndrome type 1, which is the most severe form. It is an autosomal recessive disorder caused by absent activity of the UGT1A1 gene. So severe hyperbilirubinemia develops in the first 2 to 3 days after birth, and lifelong phototherapy required unless liver transplant is performed. How for the Crigler-Najjar type 2 naman is less severe than the first form. It is also autosomal recessive. And however, there are report of autosomal dominant transmission in some cases. This is due to the reduced activity. Yung isa absent, ito naman reduced activity of UGT1A1, often responds to phenobarbital treatment. The third one will be the Gilbert syndrome. It is the most common inherited disorder of bilirubin glucuronidation due to mutation in the UGT1A1 gene. This is caused by missense mutation in the promoter region of UGT1A1, reducing production of UGT. So post-hepatic causes, on the other hand, it includes ileus or intestinal obstruction, such as due to atresia or Hirschsprungs, which increases intrahepatic circulation of bilirubin, resulting in jaundice. Now, let's differentiate breastfeeding and breast milk. So, most studies indicate that breastfeeding is a risk factor for hyperbilirubinemia. So, jaundice associated with breastfeeding is of two types based on the age of onset. So, breastfeeding associated jaundice if it occur in the first week of life. During the first week, this is caused by caloric deprivation at what we call the starvation jaundice, and due to increased intrahepatic circulation. So the exact mechanism is not clear but may involve shifts in the bilirubin pools, less efficient conjugation due to the immaturity of the liver, and due to enhanced bilirubin absorption in the intestine. For breast milk jaundice, it is caused by this is prolonged indirect hyperbilirubinemia beyond the second to third week of life. So in 10 to 30% of breastfed infants, and it may persist up to third month of age, especially for the premature infants. So reports have indicated that it may be part of physiologic jaundice. However, kernicterus may have been is also have been reported. It has been shown that almost 50% of jaundice appearing between days 4 and day 7 of life of exclusively breastfed infants is related to breast milk intake. So no single exclusive cause has been identified. However, the treatment of choice for both still is continue breastfeeding and kasi to hydrate the patient. Now, regardless of gestation or time of appearance of jaundice, patients with significant hyperbilirubinemia and those with symptoms or signs require complete diagnostic evaluation, which includes determination of the direct and indirect bilirubin fractions, also hemoglobin, retic count, blood type, Holmes test, and examination of the PBS or the peripheral blood smear. So, yun usually nire-request natin. Indirect hyperbilirubinemia and reticulocytosis in a smear with evidence of RBC destruction such as hemolysis. So in the absence of blood group incompatibility, a non-immunologically induced hemolysis should be entertained. So if the retic count Coombs test results in direct hyperbil are normal, then physiologic or pathologic indirect hyperbil may be present. If direct hyperbil is present, then diagnostic possibilities include hepatitis or congenital bile duct disorders, what we call biliary atresia, or paucity of bile ducts or biliary disease, You think also of cholestasis or cholestatic jaundice, inborn error of metabolism, presence of CF or cystic fibrosis, even congenital hemosiderosis and sepsis. So there are certain risk factors that may place the newborn at risk for developing severe hyperbilirubinemia, and this can be categorized into genetic, maternal, perinatal, and neonatal. So you see this in your book actually. So review of these risk factors is important tool in managing newborns with severe jaundice. Now, what about bilirubin encephalopathy, or what we call kernicterus? Sorry. So, kernicterus is defined as a bilirubin-induced brain dysfunction as a result of deposition of bile pigments in the nuclei of the brain and spinal cord, and by degeneration of nerve cells that occurs usually in infants as part of a syndrome of erythroblastosis fetalis. Unconjugated bilirubin is neurotoxic. We discussed this, especially to the basal ganglia in full-term infants, and to cranial nerve nuclei and thalamus in preterm infants. So, different pa yung deposition ng term and preterm. So, hyperbilirubinemia with indirect level of at least 20 milligram or more, respective of causative factor, can produce neurologic signs and symptoms in a newborn. So, in case of preterm and low birth weight infants, kernicterus may result from a lower level of bilirubin. So, first, the small ones, at least, it doesn't have to be 20 milligram. It can be lower as long as there is actually symptoms. So the basal ganglia and other nuclear areas of the brain are the predominant sites of involvement. So the most common cause is hemolytic disease of the newborn. However, conditions like Crigler-Najjar syndrome can occasionally lead to this complication. Predisposing or risk factors include prematurity or post-maturity, very low birth weight, asphyxia, acidosis, hypersmolarity such as sepsis, a hypersmolarity condition like in patient with because of dehydration. Sepsis, even in presence of meningitis, hypoalbuminemia, because we know that albumin is actually bilirubin, free bilirubin is albumin, bilirubin is albumin. It binds with albumin. Then hypothermia, hypercarbia, and even rapid rate of rise in the serum bilirubin. So signs and symptoms of kernicterus usually appear 2 to 5 days after birth in term infants and as late as 7th day of life in preterm infants. But hyperbilirubinemia may lead to encephalopathy at any time during the neonatal period. So the early signs may be subtle and indistinguishable from those of sepsis or asphyxia or even hypoglycemia or concealed bleeding like intracranial hemorrhage and other acute systemic illnesses. So lethargy, poor feeding, and loss of the motor reflex are common initial signs. Subsequently, the infant may appear gravely ill and prostrate with diminished tendon reflexes and in respiratory distress. Opisthotonus with a bulging fontanelle, twitching of the face or the limbs, and a shrill, high-pitched cry may follow. So in advanced cases, convulsions and spasm occur with affected infants stiffly extending their arms in an inward rotation with the fist clenched. So rigidity is rare at this late stage. So many infants who progress to severe form die, but those who survive usually have serious neurologic damage. So CP. A prompt exchange transfusion leads to recovery in transient bilirubin encephalopathy, and results in stage 2 and 3 are actually equivocal. So those who manage to survive are left with sequelae of extrapyramidal involvement, deafness, and mental retardation. So now the goal of therapy is to prevent bilirubin encephalopathy from happening. So phototherapy, and if it is unsuccessful, exchange transfusion remain the primary treatment modalities used to keep the maximum total bilirubin level below the pathologic levels. So what is the principle behind phototherapy? So clinical jaundice and indirect hyperbilirubinemia are reduced by exposure to high-intensity light in the visible spectrum. Bilirubin absorbs light maximally in blue range of 420 to 470 nanometer. So bilirubin in the skin absorbs light energy, causing several photochemical reactions. So one major product from phototherapy is a result of reversible photoisomerization reaction, converting the toxic native unconjugated 4C15Z bilirubin into unconjugated configurational isomer, which is 4Z15E bilirubin, which can then be excreted in bile without conjugation. So the other major product from phototherapy is lumirubin. This is more permanent, which is an irreversible structural isomer converted from native bilirubin that can be excreted by the kidneys in the unconjugated form. So ito lang yung type na ini-excrete ng kidney unconjugated. Kasi 'di ba we see in the pathophysiology mostly conjugated type yung ini-excrete sa kidneys, 'di ba? So the therapeutic effect of phototherapy depends on the light energy emitted in the effective range of wavelengths. So the distance between the light and the infant and the surface area of exposed skin, as well as the rate of hemolysis and in vivo metabolism and excretion of bilirubin. So complications associated with phototherapy include loose stools due to overexposure, erythematous macular rashes, purpuric rash associated with transient for porphyrinemia, hypothermia from overexposure. Kasi hindi siya malamig eh. Hindi siya mainit eh. So that's why some patient would develop, especially the small ones, can develop hypothermia. Overheating, in some cases, dehydration, due to increased accessible water loss and diarrhea associated with it, and what we call bronze baby syndrome, or which is a benign condition. So this occur in presence of direct hyperbilirubinemia. So once the baby is overexposed, baby can develop bronze baby syndrome, and you have to manage naman the direct hyperbil type. So almost all infants observed with this syndrome have a significant elevated level of the direct bilirubin. So as you see in the in your serum level. So but you have to rule out an obstructive type of liver disease in this case. So discoloration may result from photo-induced modification of porphyrins, which are often present during cholestatic jaundice and may last for many months. So despite bronze baby syndrome, phototherapy can continue if needed. Phototherapy is contraindicated, on the other hand, in the presence of porphyria. What about IVIG administration? Its use is recommended when serum bilirubin is approaching exchange level despite maximal interventions, including phototherapy. So the dose is 0.5 to 1 gram per kilo per dose, repeat in 12 hours. Then this reduces the need for exchange transfusion in both EBO and RH hemolytic disease. Exchange transfusion naman, on the other hand, is performed if intensive phototherapy failed to reduce bilirubin level to a safe range. Yung safe range, it depends on the graph. So we have a graph where you plot the level of the TSB. And the risk of cardiac exceeds the procedural risk normogram with a TSB level of at least 25 milligram per deciliter or greater, and with jaundice and signs and symptoms of acute bilirubin encephalopathy. Ang goal kasi is actually for the patient not to develop bilirubin encephalopathy. This is a very actually invasive procedure kasi you're actually exchanging at least 80% of the baby's blood type, circulating blood, when you do double volume exchange transfusion. Now we move on to anemia. There are two types of incompatibilities, RH and ABO incompatibility. So anemia is extremely common worldwide, affecting about 25% of the global population, and has a broad differential diagnosis in infants and children. So in neonates, it can be due to blood loss, increased RBC destruction, or overproduction of erythrocytes. So in many cases, the clinical context, medical history, physical examination, and clinical course can be diagnostic. So how do we approach a newborn with anemia? So this is the diagnostic algorithm of anemia in newborn. Simple and efficient laboratory workup such as CBC and retic count can actually give a rapid definitive diagnosis and suggest an effective treatment strategy. If the retic count is low, then they think of hyperproliferative disease or congenital infections. If the retic count naman is normal or high, then you think of blood loss or hemolysis. Hence, a comb test is requested. If positive, consider hemolytic diseases. If negative, look at the mean corpuscular volume or MCV. So if low, consider alpha thalassemia. If normal or high, then you check the PBS. And these are the possible considerations based on the PBS result. So in terms of managing anemia, the decision to transfuse depends on the severity of the symptoms, the hemoglobin concentration, and the presence of comorbidities that can alter oxygen delivery, such as in the presence of pulmonary hypertension, bronchopulmonary dysplasia, or in CCHD, or critical cyanotic heart disease, or other respiratory pathology. Kasi in newborn, we at least maintain a hematocrit level of 40. So that's the lowest actually. Average would be about 45 to 50, even 60 is actually acceptable. Benefits should be balanced between against the risk and transfusion decisions. Should also consider the time course in which anemia developed, whether ongoing blood loss is present or hemolysis are anticipated, and if there are any planned surgical interventions. So we don't just transfuse left and right kasi nga we also have to check the necessity. So it depends on the clinical condition of the patient. What about hemolytic disease of the fetus and the newborn? So this is also known as erythroblastosis fetalis. It is a broad diagnosis. It is a broad diagnosis that applies to any fetus or neonate who develops alloimmune hemolysis caused by transplacental passage of maternal antibodies directed against paternally derived red cell antigens. So, although more than 60 different RBC antigens can elicit a maternal antibody response, clinically significant disease is most often associated with incompatibility in ABO. Blood groups or rhesus antigen and less frequently may be due to differences in other Rh system antigens or by other RBC antigens such as the CAL. So these three are the most common hemolytic anemia. Hemolytic disease of the causing hemolytic disease of the newborn. So early recognition and diagnosis facilitate timely intervention to prevent adverse sequelae. So ito lang yung tatlong tandaan nyo, tatlong diseases. So what is isoimmune rhesus factor? Or what we call erythroblastosis fetalis. So about 1 in 5 mothers with Rh negative blood group have trouble with their babies. So the problem arises when the mother is carrying an Rh positive baby. So the mother is Rh negative, the baby is Rh positive kasi from the father. So among the Rh factors, D is the one that almost always involved. So the first baby is rarely affected. Kasi wala pa siyang virgin pa kasi yung 'di ba? Virgin pa yung environment. So, clinically, Rh hemolytic disease may manifest as Hytrop's fetalis or icterius gravis or hemolytic anemia. So there are 3 types. What is Hytrop's fetalis? So this is the most severe form of the disease. The infant is often preterm and may die in utero or shortly after birth from severe anemia and heart failure. So he is markedly dematous with effusion in serous cavities and has gross hepatosplenomegaly. So in case of stillbirth, the fetus may be macerated. Placenta is always large and edematous. Now, the second type is icterus gravis, when hemolysis in utero is less intense, then deep jaundice appears during the first 24 hours of life, with progressive anemia and hepatosplenomegaly are invariably present. Some may have purpura. Then incidence of kernicterus is actually high in this group. Those who manage to survive are often left with sequelae. So condition in which an Rh negative mom may give birth to an neonate without icterus are when the father too is actually Rh negative. So pareho silang Rh negative. Then the baby will either will be Rh negative also. So when father is heterogeneous or heterozygous Rh positive, in which case there is 25% chance of an Rh negative newborn, when the ABO incompatibility accompanies Rh incompatibility. So when mother is also a non-reactor, in which case she is unable to respond by producing antibodies. So these are only the four conditions in which an Rh mother may give birth to an unit without icterus or without jaundice, without developing jaundice. What about congenital hemolytic anemia? So this is the mildest form, but also the rarest form of Rh hemolytic disease. So jaundice is generally absent. Anemia and hepatosplenomegaly are often detected towards the end of the first week or later. So diagnosis has to be made in fetus or immediately after birth if serious consequences of disease are to be prevented. So the foremost investigation is to demonstrate that the mother is Rh negative whereas the infant is Rh positive. So occasionally an Rh positive infant uh may infant may type as our Rh negative because of the blocking antibodies. So if possible, the father's Rh group should also be tested. So, kasi nga yung for conditions that may give rise to an non-enteric baby. So direct Coombs test on infants' red cells is actually positive. Anti-Rh titer of mother is high. And other investigations show high serum bilirubin with indirect level or unconjugated type, presence of reticulocytosis, anemia, and an anti-Rh agglutinin and hypoglycemia. So for diagnosis of fetus at risk, amniocentesis may be performed by abdominal puncture and a small amount of fluid obtained for spectrophotomeric analysis. At elevated peak of 450 millimole, after 24 hours of gestation is indication for intrauterine transfusion. So every Rh negative mother who also give birth to an Rh positive baby should be given 1 ml of anti-D immunoglobulin IM within 72 hours of delivery. So this destroys or coats the Rh positive cells that have managed to enter the maternal blood and thus prevent formation of antibodies. So the results of these injections are extremely rewarding as far as prevention of isoimmunization is concerned. So this is more actually the subsequent birth is actually more symptomatic than the first baby. What about ABO incompatibility? So, pregnant women with A or B blood type tend to produce antibodies, mostly of the IgM class. So, in contrast, a pregnant woman with a type O blood produce antibodies mostly of the IgG class. So, only IgG crosses the placenta and plays a causative role in isoimmune hemolytic anemia. Therefore, infants born to a mother of type A or B tend to have a milder hemolysis. Hemolysis tend to be milder than Rh compatibility because A and B antigens are expressed in all tissues in the body, including placenta, therefore diluting and neutralizing the maternal antibody. Direct Coombs usually is weakly positive or negative, while indirect Coombs generally positive, although it could have a negative result as well. Microspherosis, microspherocytosis with polychromasia or spherocytes, reticulocytosis, increased circulated RBCs on blood smear can be seen. And if severe, may have anemia in the first 24 hours of life with indirect hyperbilirubinemia, but it can also have a late anemia up to the first month of life. Kasi ongoing pa rin yung hemolysis niya, but not as severe as the first week of life. Okay, what about thrombocytopenia? So in thrombocytopenia, you have to distinguish whether the baby is sick or well. So commonness for well babies is autoimmune and autoimmune. And for sick babies naman is sepsis and DIC. What is autoimmune? Autoimmune if transference of antiplatelet antibodies as that of lupus or ITP, and you have to compare the maternal platelet also. So maternal, both the maternal and the newborn platelets are actually low for autoimmune. For alloimmune naman, there is transplacental transference of maternal antibodies like in RH disease with normal maternal platelets. So si mommy, normal ng platelets, si baby is low. So that's alloimmune. If in severe, can have IC bleed and death in 20% of cases. So you have to closely monitor this patients. Okay. What about polycythemia? Polycythemia is defined as a hemoglobin of more than 20 grams per deciliter or a hematocrit of more than 65% based on peripheral venous sample. This is due to the increased RBC mass or decreased plasma. So usually it's due to increased transplacental transfusion. 'Di ba? Remember in unang yakap we do properly timed cord clamping, then actually that could be that this can cause increased transplacental transfusion causing polycythemia. So newborn hematocrit concentrations peak at second hour of life, then steadily decline over the next 6 to 24 hours of life. So capillary measurements usually yield higher values than venous or arterial. So this is present in 1 to 5% of newborns, but only less of this show actually clinical symptoms or what we call ang tawag dito hyperviscosity syndrome. So pathophysiology could either be primary or secondary. Primary is caused by increased fetal production of erythropoietin, while for secondary it is caused by transfer of RBC mass to the fetus. Ito yung transplacental transfusion. So at high hematocrit levels, plasma viscosity is increased, posing a potential risk to the newborn of secondary symptoms. It's typically present in hematocrit level of more than 70. So primary effects would for those with primary, there would be fetal growth restrictions, maternal insulin dependent diabetes. This is caused by maternal diabetes, maternal insulin dependent DM, or it could be secondary to neonatal thyrotoxicosis or presence of trisomy 21 or Down syndrome, or even in patients with the Beckwith-Wiedemann syndrome. For secondary effects naman, could be from twin-to-twin transfusion syndrome, maternal fetal transfusion, as I have discussed, yung transplacental transfusion, delayed cord clamping, perinatal asphyxia also could be a secondary effect. So symptoms potentially due to hyperviscosity syndrome. So these include plethora, lethargy, tachypnea, hepatomegaly could also be observed, also hypoglycemia, as well as hypocalcemia and thrombocytopenia. How do we manage? So we do partial volume transfusion, exchange transfusion. For DVET or for hyperbilirubinemia, we do double volume exchange transfusion naman. For polycythemia naman, we do partial exchange transfusion. Okay. So how do we do that? So this is how we get it, how we compute for the amount of blood to be extract. So observed hematocrit over desired hematocrit over observed hematocrit times the infant's blood volume. For a full term, we compute it at 80. For premature, we compute at 100. Then, desired level should be 55 to 60 lang kasi yun naman yung acceptable. Okay, let's go to hemostasis. So, a scenario again, a baby delivered at home with precipitous delivery was admitted to NICU and discharged with mother. Baby was exclusively breastfed and was found to have fresh bleeding per rectum on the fourth day of life. There were no other signs of site of bleeding on history, and clinical examination was normal. So what is the next immediate step? So what do we have? So this is a classic picture of a patient with vitamin K deficiency. So, any hemorrhagic manifestations due to deficiency of the vitamin K-dependent clotting factor is known as bleeding secondary to vitamin K deficiency. So, coagulation factors 2, 7, 9, 10, and GLA proteins such as protein C, S, and Z depend on vitamin K for their activity. So, now let's first review the coagulation pathway. So, the clotting cascade is a series of enzymatic reaction that ends in the formation of fibrin protein fiber mesh that stabilizes the platelet plug. So the clotting cascade can be triggered by the intrinsic or the extrinsic pathway. In the intrinsic pathway, it precipitates clotting within damaged vessels. So this pathway, which involves 7 separate steps, is set off when the factor 12 or the Hageman factor is activated by coming in contact with either exposed collagen in uninjured blood vessels. So note that the exposed collagen initiates the intrinsic pathway. For the extrinsic pathway, this requires only 4 steps, which starts when damaged tissues expose tissue factor, also known as the tissue thromboplastin. So when a tissue is traumatized, it releases tissue factor, which directly activates factor 10. So from this point on, the two pathways unite to form thrombin. The intrinsic and the extrinsic mechanism usually operate simultaneously, and clots are fully formed in 3 to 6 minutes. In vitamin K, what is vitamin K? It's a fat-soluble vitamin which is required for gamma carboxylation of glutamic acid residues on precursors of vitamin K-dependent coagulation factors such as 2, 7, 9, 10, C, Z, and Z. Thus, deficiency of this cofactor would prevent fibrin formation, thus causing bleeding. So who are the newborns predisposed to develop vitamin K deficiency? Those with minimal transplacental passage of vitamin K, those with limited hepatic storage of vitamin K, as well as low concentration of vitamin K in the breast milk and absence of bacterial intestinal flora, which normally produce or responsible for the production of synthesis of vitamin K. So what is HDN? So hemorrhagic disease of the newborn typically results from severe transient deficiencies in vitamin K dependent factors, which is characterized by bleeding that leads to be that either could be from the GIT or nasal or subgaleal space or intracranial or post circumcision. So there are 3 types. The early is manifested or observed during the first 24 hours. It presents with serious bleeding such as intracranial hemorrhage. Could be caused by a maternal drug such as phenobarbital or phenytoin, warfarin also, and anti-TB drugs such as rifampicin and isoniazid. So this drug interferes with vitamin K, hence causing deficient and bleeding, predisposed to bleeding. Also, patient with inherited coagulopathy is also present this type early. What about classical? It usually onset is on the 2nd or to 7 days of life. In the absence of vitamin K prophylaxis, incidence is about 0.25 to 1.7%, or approximately 2% if not given vitamin K. So it presents with GI bleeding or intracranial hemorrhage or skin bruising or bleeding following circumcision and tends to occur in infants who did not receive vitamin K at birth, like in our patient, and exclusively breastfed. Site of bleeding include GIT, the ENT, eyes, ears, nose, throat, mucosal or intracranial, circumcision site, cutaneous or skin or injection sites. So, etiology involves vitamin K deficiency or breastfeeding. For the late type naman, it typically presents during the first 6 months of life. And these are infants who are exclusively breastfed and usually incidence dependent on the primary disease. Causes could include associated disease process that interferes with absorption of vitamin K, such as in cholestatic jaundice, or malabsorption of vitamin K, like in presence of biliary atresia or cystic fibrosis and hepatitis. Risk factors include beta lipoprotein deficiency. It could be idiopathic or secondary to warfarin ingestion. Typically presents with GI bleeding, prolonged bleeding after circumcision, epistaxis, ecchymosis, or intracranial hemorrhage, or bleeding from umbilicus or cephalhematoma. Now, what are the laboratory exams that we actually request for? So you check the coagulation profile, pro time, activated prothrombin time, fibrinogen levels, and as well as the platelet count. Prolonged PT is usually the first lab test with normal APTT, fibrinogen, and platelet count as well. So, imaging studies include CT scan or MRI or ultrasonography, and you can also request for liver function tests, for stool exams, for presence of occult blood, as well as liver biopsy for patients with the late type. Okay. Treatment includes actually intramuscular injection of 1 milligram vitamin K is actually preventable. It prevents the disease in vitamin K dependent factors in full-term infants. For intracranial hemorrhage, the primary serious complication of vitamin K deficiency. However, other complications include anaphylactic like reactions during IV administration of vitamin K, or hyperbilirubinemia or hemolytic anemia after high doses of vitamin K, as well as hematoma on the injection site if administered IM. Prognosis-wise, in the absence of intracranial hemorrhage, the prognosis is actually excellent in an otherwise healthy infant. So long-term sequelae if intracranial hemorrhage include motor and intellectual deficit. Okay, now we go to endocrine problems. So IEMs are the consequence of mutations in the deoxyribonucleic acid or DNA, which code for a specific protein that acts as an enzyme, a receptor, a transport vehicle, or a membrane pump or a structural element. So any in the pathway can actually cause defect in the pathway can actually cause IEM. So absence of a single enzyme leading to disturbance in that particular metabolic pathway, causing accumulation of the compounds proximal to the enzymatic block or deficiency of the product distal to it, is the underlying causative factor in a large majority of cases. For acute illness, early onset usually present in the first day of life, especially in preterm infants, points to a severe type of disease. So delayed onset, such as an intermediate or mild disease, usually the term unit appears normal at birth, but then unexpectedly shows deterioration in health status. Manifestations include vomiting, breathlessness or tachypnea, even seizure, decrease in tone or flappiness in a particular body or urine odor, depending on the causative IEM, as you see in this slide. So there is a specific smell associated with a certain condition. Additional features include facial dysmorphism, presence of cataract or retinopathy, even deafness or hepatomegaly, as well as cardiomyopathy and multicystic dysplastic kidneys, are also some would have a specific smell, actually, which can help aid us in the diagnosis of a particular IEM. Okay, let's go to this case. So baby delivered after difficult vaginal delivery to a mother with gestational DM poorly controlled by insulin. Baby was for 3 grams, was sent to NICU where he developed tachypnea and jitteriness. What is the possible cause for tachypnea and jitteriness of this baby? If you could still remember the different di ba, respiratory conditions causing tachypnea, one of these would be what? Do you think so? Which is associated with this condition? What do you think, guys? Correct. Hypoglycemia. So in hypoglycemia, how does it how was it parang how does or what causes neonatal hypoglycemia? So the probable pathogenic sequence is that the maternal hyperglycemia causes fetal hyperglycemia. As you see here, see in this table, it's actually in Nelson's. Everything is in Nelson's, by the way. And then the fetal pancreatic response leads to fetal hyperinsulinism. So maternal hyperglycemia causes fetal hyperglycemia, and then the fetal pancreas would respond to causing fetal hyperinsulinemia or hyperinsulinism. So it is important to recognize that while maternal glucose crosses the placenta, maternal and exogenous insulin does not. So fetal hyperinsulinemia and hyperglycemia then cause increased hepatic glucose uptake and glycogen synthesis, causing accelerated lipogenesis and augmented protein synthesis. So related pathologic findings are hypertrophy and hyperplasia of the pancreatic beta cells with increased weight of the placenta and infant organs except the brain. So pwede liver, pwede yung heart, everything. So can also cause myocardial hypertrophy, increased amount of cytoplasm in the liver, and extramedullary hematopoiesis. So hyperinsulinism and hyperglycemia produce a fetal acidosis, which may result in an increased rate of stillbirth. Kaya associated ang stillbirth in patient with in IDM or infant of diabetic mother. So separation of the placenta at birth suddenly interrupts glucose infusion into the neonate without a proportional effects on hyperinsulinism. So leading to hypoglycemia during the first starting in the first few hours of life could be up to actually 4th to 5th day of life. Some would have at least up to the first week of life. So clinical manifestation in symptomatic hypoglycemia includes sweating, lethargy, irritability, or jitteriness, even tachycardia or tachypnea, and cyanosis or presence of apneic spells and seizures. So seizures medyo ano na yun, severe na ibig sabihin the hypoglycemia is so severe that there is actually wala ng glucose substrate na magamit ang brain for its function. So the risk of rebound hypoglycemia can be diminished by tight glucose control during labor and delivery, even actually during the entire pregnancy. So very important ang normal glucose level or good glucose control. So how do we treat this? It is treatment for symptomatic neonate consists of giving IV bolus of D10 water at 2 ml per kilo. So this needs to be followed by an IV dextrose of at least GIR, a glucose infusion rate of 4 to 10 milligram per kilo per minute until the blood serum glucose is actually more than 40 milligram per deciliter. We can give steroids in the presence of prednisolone at 1 to 2 milligram per kilo or hydrocortisone at 5 milligram per kilo every 12 hours. And this is indicated if hypoglycemia remains unresponsive after 12 to 24 hours of IV drip. What we do actually, we maximize dextrosity of the glucose. Hindi lang siya D10. We can actually give up to D25. Yun lang, medyo super taas na siya. And there should be a central line in place to deliver that high of a glucose, high of dextrosity. Glucagon, IM or IV, or solely or in combination with epinephrine, IMR, IV, or subcutaneously given, is indicated in hypoglycemia associated with maternal diabetes or RH incompatibility. And diazoside at 25 milligram per kilo in 3 to 4 divided doses is particular value if in patient with intractable hypoglycemia in patient with IDM. So how do we prevent this? Actually, early initiation of breastfeeding within the first hour of life is actually helps a lot, as well as prevention of prematurity, low birth weight are important preventive strategies, as well as a good control during pregnancy. So prognosis-wise, patient with neonatal hypoglycemia, if not controlled, may be fatal. Actually, 50% of low birth weight in patient with IDM survivors may show evidence of CP or epilepsy or presence of mental retardation. Kasi what's so happen kasi in patient, if in seizure associated with neonatal hypoglycemia, lahat ng part of the brain is actually seizing because yung hypoglycemia is actually, 'di ba, ano siya, the brain itself is reacting to the hypoglycemia. Unlike in patients with asphyxia, if you remember our discussion in asphyxia, in birth asphyxia or HIE, 'di ba? Certain part of the brain land is actually damaged. But in neonatal hypoglycemia, it's actually the entire part of the brain that is actually involved in the seizure. That's why the seizure associated with neonatal hypoglycemia is more actually detrimental, more bad. It's worse compared to other seizure. And almost always ano siya, associated with CP or mental retardation later on. Okay, now we move on to neonatal sepsis. Infections in the newborn can be classified by their timing relative to birth, which includes congenital, perinatal, or early onset and late onset disease. So these are clinically useful designations because of the mechanism of infections, their etiologies and outcomes are distinct at each stage. So therefore, neonatal sepsis is a clinical syndrome of systemic illness accompanied by bacteremia in the first month of life. So let's define first these terminologies. Congenital infections denotes infection acquired in utero. So such infections are generally caused by virus or a non-bacterial organisms and are often associated with injury to the developing organs, common of which is the torch infection. Perinatal infection, on the other hand, indicates some acquisition around the time of delivery up to the first week of life. So perinatally acquired organisms include both bacteria and viruses, some of which are the same as those causing congenital infection, but often manifest with different features like patient with syphilis or chlamydia. So early onset infection naman, on the other hand, it occurs in the first week of life, is generally the consequence of an infection caused by organism acquired during perinatal period. So late onset infection occurs between 7 and 30 days of life. And this include infection from bacteria, viruses, or other organisms that are typically acquired postnatally. So different experts use 72 hours or 7 days as cutoff. So what we use is 72 hours if the baby is admitted in the NICU, and 7 days if the patient is not admitted or in the community level. So very late onset naman is typically parang onset is beyond the first month of life. These usually occur in very low birth weight infants or term infants requiring prolonged intensive neonatal care. So those who are still admitted beyond the first month of life, then they can actually present with very late onset, and this is typically caused by fungal infections or yung mga gram-positive infections if there is a central line in place. So the incidence of neonatal bacterial sepsis varies from 1 to 4 per 1,000 live births with geographic variation and change over time. So studies suggest that male infants have a higher incidence of sepsis than term females. This sex difference is less clear in preterm low birth weight, by the way. So attack rates of neonatal sepsis increase significantly in low birth weight infants in the presence of maternal chorioamnionitis or congenital immune defects or mutations of the genes involved in innate immune system, or in the presence of asthenia, galactosemia due to susceptibility to E. coli infections, as well as presence of malformations leading to high inoculum of bacteria, like in patients with leaking meningocele. So in our country, neonatal sepsis is the second leading cause of infant mortality, approximately 12.5% after prematurity. Okay, why is neonate susceptible or prone to invasive disease? This is because of the lack of full responsive innate immunity. So innate immune system is the body's first line of defense and is intended to prevent infection and attack from the invading pathogen. So this is categorized into three defense mechanisms: the physical barrier, which is the skin, the cellular component, and the humoral responses. So this actually illustrates the development of the innate immunity from fetus to adulthood. So this also shows why preterm infants are most susceptible to infection. As you see, it's in your picture. Dapat in your book. Dapat pala when while we're discussing, you also have your book open to the specific page. Anyway, so in the skin, which is the topmost layer, you see that the preterms have a very thin, very immature and incompetent stratum corneum. However, this improves as gestation at age increases. So the vernix caseosa and the skin epithelia of a full-term infants robustly express antimicrobial proteins and peptides, what we call the APPs, which has a direct role in defense against bacteria. Next would be the mucous membrane. So in parallel with and induced by an increasingly complex microbiota, the newborn intestinal mucosal epithelium rapidly changes structurally with an increase in the population of crypts and crypt-based palate cells, as well as functionally with increasing APP expressions. So also maternal IgG can also be seen during this time, which is evident of maternal transfer of IgGs during the third trimester. So kaya yung mga premature, mas susceptible sila kasi ang start of maternal IgG transfer is around 36 weeks yung maximum, but as early as 34 weeks could have a minimal transfer. So lastly, the composition of the neonatal blood is distinct with relatively low concentration of complement components in APPs and high concentration of immunosuppressive purine metabolite adenosine. So plasma also contains maternal antibodies that are transferred beginning mid-gestation and supplemented by postnatal factors derived from breast milk. That's why very important that we actually breastfeed because of this benefit. So innate immunity is detectable from the end of first month of gestation, with changes driven largely by the increasing exposure to environmental microbes. Neonatal antigen-presenting cells, such as the monocytes, express patterns. A recognition receptor example of which is the toll-like receptors, which have a distinct functional response, including limited T1 polarizing cytokine production to most stimuli. Adaptive immunity, on the other hand, the man develops from 4 weeks of gestation onward, with changes driven by evolving chimerism, reflecting fetal, regulatory T cells, T cell rich lymphocytes, and more adult-like lymphocytes with distinct epigenetically encoded functional programs. Okay, how does the immature immune system contribute to this? So the immature immune system is the major contributing factor for increased neonatal susceptibility to sepsis. So the immature function of polymorphonuclear neutrophils, macrophages, and T lymphocytes make these cells incapable of carrying out a complete inflammatory response in neonates. So you see it actually in the first slide. Furthermore, neonates have a limited number of immunoglobulins at birth and cannot generate a quantitative or a qualitative adequate mounting response against infectious agents. So the insufficient time that premature has in utero or in the uterus decrease the transfer of immunoglobulins to the fetus. So this deficiency in immunoglobulins makes premature infants at much higher risk for sepsis when compared to term infants. So the most important neonatal factor predisposing to infection is prematurity or low birth weight. So preterm infants have a 3 to 10-fold higher incidence of infection than full-term normal birth weight infants. So possible explanations include first, the maternal genital tract infection is considered to be an important cause of preterm labor with an increased risk of vertical transmission to the newborn. Next, the frequency of intraamniotic infection is inversely related to gestational age. And lastly, premature infants have documented immune dysfunction, as we have discussed. So this is mainly due to decreased IgG antibodies in complement opsonizations and complement activation. Also, the compromised innate immune system is caused by primarily of immature epithelial barrier, as we have actually also discussed. Lastly, premature infants often require prolonged intravenous access, intubations, or other invasive procedures that provide a port of entry or impair barrier and clearance mechanisms, putting them at contingent risk for hospital-acquired infections. Now, we defined early onset. Okay, for early onset, this is caused by transmission of pathogens from female genital urinary tract to the newborn or the fetus. So these pathogens can ascend the vagina, the vaginal tract, cervix, and uterus, and also infect the amniotic fluid. So neonates can also become infected in utero or during delivery as they pass through the vaginal tract. Or it may get colonized with aerobic and anaerobic organisms and either result in ascending amniotic infections or colonizations of the neonate at birth. So vertical transmission of bacterial agents that infect the amniotic fluid and vaginal canal may occur in utero or more often during labor and delivery. So GBS or group B streptococcus and E. coli and coagulase negative staphylococcus as well as H. influenzae type B and Listeria monocytogenes are the most common organism causing early onset sepsis. Maternal factors include risk of include chorioamnionitis, GBS colonizations, delivery before 37 weeks of life, PROM greater than 18 hours also are risk factors. While late onset naman occurs via transmission of pathogens from surrounding environment after delivery, such as contact from a healthcare worker or a caregiver, may also be caused by late manifestations of vertically transmitted infections. So infants require intravascular access or other invasive procedures disrupt the mucosa, thereby increasing risk for developing the late onset sepsis. So the following are the clinical symptoms most often observed in neonates suspected to have sepsis. So initial diagnosis of sepsis is by necessity a clinical one. So it is crucial to begin treatment before the results of a culture are actually available. Clinical signs and symptoms are non-specific and differential diagnosis is quite broad. So some signs are actually very subtle or insidious in onset, and therefore a high index of suspicion is required to identify and evaluate infected neonates. So this table lists the WHO criteria for sepsis. So infants should be reevaluated over time to determine whether the symptoms have progressed from mild to severe. Now, what is the clinical manifestation of infection? It depends on the virulence of infecting organism in the body's inflammatory response. So we call this systemic inflammatory response syndrome, which is used to describe the unique process of infection and subsequent systemic response. So SIRS may result from trauma or hemorrhagic sepsis or other cause of ischemia other than infection, as well as can be due to neck or bronchitis. So patients with SIRS have a spectrum of clinical syndrome that represent progressive stages of pathologic response or process. So in neonates and pediatric patients, SEERS manifests as temperature instability or respiratory dysfunction, cardiac dysfunction, and pulmonary abnormalities. So increased vascular permeability results in capillary leak into the peripheral tissues and lungs and resultant peripheral and pulmonary edema. So DIC results in a more severely affected cases. So the cascade of escalating tissue injury may lead to multi-system organ failure and even death. So there are DNAs who appear to have sepsis or SEERS, but no bacterial or viral pathogen have been recovered. So culture negative sepsis may be due to hard to get culture, such as anaerobic infections or viruses, as well as non-infectious inflammatory conditions. In addition, this could be a result of an undetected localized source with transient bacteremia, like in presence of osteomyelitis, or if there is prior treatment of antibiotics, as well as if there is a poor culture technique. Now, maternal history in infant clinical signs should guide diagnostic evaluation. So sometimes signs of systemic infection in newborns are unrevealing. Laboratory investigation play a particularly important role in the diagnosis. So it's actually in your slides. So typically we ask for a blood culture. It should be immediately drawn, and then culture media microorganism, if positive, will be revealed in 48 hours of incubation. Okay. So how do we approach treatment? So empiric treatment with antibiotics should be started as soon as sepsis is clinically suspected, even without confirmatory laboratory data. So in general, antimicrobial resistance patterns of common bacteria in the neonatal intensive care unit should guide antibiotics initial choice. So typical treatment regimens include ampicillin and aminoglycosides to cover for the most common pathogens for the early onset. For late onset naman, nosocomial coverage should be provided by the hospital-acquired infections. So it depends on the antibiogram of the hospital actually for the treatment of second line or for the treatment of late onset sepsis. However, ceftriaxone should be avoided because it can lead to hyperbilirubinemia and serious precipitation of calcium ceftriaxone crystals. So increasing antibiotic resistance is a concern for neonatal sepsis. So antibiotic stewardship teams play an essential role in preventing unjustified prolonged use of antibiotics. So definitive treatment is based on the identification and susceptibility of the offending organism. So kung ano yung least broad antibiotic with activity against the organism is actually chosen. So duration of therapy depends on the organisms and the site of infection. So if it's culture proven, usually 10-day course. However, if there is presence of meningitis, we extend up to 21 days or up to 28 days, depending on the actually identified focus. Okay, what about preventive measures? So, in presence of PROM, intrapartum antibiotic prophylaxis is actually advisable or part of the standard treatment protocol, as well as administration of this is via administration of ampicillin or penicillin at least 4 hours prior to delivery. So this table summarizes the management plans and preventive strategies for neonatal sepsis. It's also in your book. With early diagnosis and treatment, most infants will recover and not have any long-term problems. However, mortality rate is still significant. So for early onset sepsis, there is 5 to 10%. For late onset naman is about 2 to 6%. So mortality rates are inversely proportional to gestational age, such that the preterm or the younger ones have higher mortality rates than do the term infants. For the very low birth weight infants with EOS, the fatality rate is about up to high as 16%. So E. coli has been found to be associated with higher mortality rate when compared to GPS because of intrapartum prophylaxis. Okay. So the treatment of clinically suspected neonates with negative culture has also significantly decreased mortality rates. So preterm infants with sepsis may develop impaired neurodevelopment later on, actually. That's why important that we closely monitor these infants. What about complications? Neonatal sepsis remains a significant contributor to morbidity and mortality of neonates, and prematurity and delayed treatment are commonly associated with adverse outcomes. Very low birth weight infants have been found to have a higher risk of chronic lung disease, and extremely low birth weight infants, on the other hand, are at a greater risk of neurodevelopmental impairments such as hearing or visual deficits, presence of CP, as well as impaired psychomotor and mental development later on. So on the other hand, the unnecessary overuse of antibiotics can increase the chance of severe candidiasis and multi-drug resistant organisms. So these are some of the preventive measures and supportive measures that we can actually do. Okay, now we go to congenital infection. So any infections acquired transplacentally during gestation is a congenital infection. So this could be caused by a wide array of organisms like bacteria, viruses, fungi, and protozoa. So the route and timing of infection can provide helpful clues as to the potential infectious agent or etiology. First trimester infections may alter embryogenesis and result in malformations of the heart and the eyes, as seen in congenital rubella syndrome. However, third trimester infection naman can result in active infection with signs of hepatomegaly, splenomegaly, and generalized lymphadenopathy at birth, such as in patients with CMV or toxoplasmosis. Infections that occur late in gestation may lead to a delay in clinical manifestations until weeks to years after birth. Is a classic example of this is congenital syphilis. However, intrauterine infections from CMV, Treponema pallidum, tox, yung thrush infections actually, including varicella and human parvovirus B19 may cause minimal or no signs or symptoms in the mother but may still be transmitted across the placenta to the fetus. So the presence of maternal antibodies to rubella prevents maternal infection and congenital transmission, but transmission across the placenta, a CMV, can occur actually despite pre-existing immunity, albeit a lower rate compared to primary maternal CMV infection. So regardless of the maternal immune status, the placenta may act as a barrier and the fetus may or may not be infected. So if infection does occur, signs may or may not be noted in the fetus during pregnancy, or it can result in spontaneous abortion, congenital malformations, intrauterine growth restrictions, preterm delivery, as well as stillbirths, or acute or delayed disease in the neonate, or asymptomatic persistent infection with sequelae later on, as you see in congenital syphilis. Okay, so now the clinical manifestation of intrauterine infection can range from asymptomatic to severe multi-organ systemic complications. So for some agents such as CMV and treponema or syphilis, causing syphilis, ongoing injury after birth can lead to late sequelae as well. So the specific clinical signs in the newborn period are usually not sufficient to make a definitive diagnosis, but are useful to guide more specific laboratory testing. In symptomatic congenital infections often affect the CNS as well as the reticuloendothelial system. So dalawa lang yan, either the bone marrow and the rest, which includes the bone marrow, liver and spleen, and as well as the CNS, including the eyes. So this table actually presents the clinical manifestation of some specific congenital infections. Of note is congenital Zika virus infection, which has features that are rarely seen in other congenital infections. So some conditions present as syndromes, which is particular to a specific organism, as you see in this slide. So this also provides late sequelae of some of these congenital infections as well. Now we go to preventive measures. So this include behavioral and therapeutic interventions. Counseling-based interventions are effective in reducing CMV infections, but few health care providers report counseling their patients on CMV prevention. Counseling on hygiene practices, such as washing the hands after diaper change or avoiding contact with saliva, decreases actually CMV transmission. Safer sex practice, safe food preparation practices, and preventing mosquito bites are some of the common recommendations that prevent congenital and perinatal infections, as well as prenatal and maternal vaccination and control of existing maternal infections or other strategies of preventing congenital infections. Now we go to surgical abdomen. So failure to pass meconium within the first 24 to 48 of life with feeding intolerance, abdominal distension, and bilious emesis are the hallmarks of intestinal obstruction in the newborn, and this evoke a differential diagnosis of obstruction based on anatomic, metabolic, and functional considerations. So I only identified the common congenital anomalies seen in the neonatal period. So first is congenital hyperplastic pyloric stenosis. This is commonly seen in male patients associated with blood group O and B. This presents with non-bilious vomiting, dehydration, with hypochloremic, hypokalemic, metabolic alkalosis. And you see the target. This is actually the pathognomonic sign, the target sign or the bullseye sign in ultrasound or string sign in barium enema. Ito yung string sign in barium enema. Treatment is pyloromyotomy. What about esophageal atresia? There are different types. This is the 5 types. 30, 30 to 40% associated with abnormalities in the velar or the bacterial association. Each type is the distal TEF, mali. Yung proximal EA with distal TEF. Proximal EA to. Proximal EA with distal TEF. This is actually the most common, while the H type naman is the rarest. Okay, surgical approach, primary or delayed, can be done in stages. So depending on the yung distance between the two athletic portion. So we go to this case. So baby is delivered to mother with history of polyhydramnios. Mother had irregular antenatal care. Baby did not tolerate feeds and started to have bilious vomiting. OG tube could be passed through the stomach, and abdominal chest radiograph show this sign. So we see a double bubble sign. Always pag any GI tract anomaly, it would present with polyhydramnios. Any naman nephro anomaly could present with anhydramnios. Okay, what is this condition? Where do you see this condition? So this is what we call duodenal atresia, which is highly associated with trisomy 21, some with congenital heart disease or presence of malrotation or alveolar pancreas, as well as esophageal atresia. So this is due to the failure of recanalization of intestinal tube during the 8 to 10th week of gestation. So in utero, you see actually polyhydramnios and distended duodenum. Postnatally, patient will present with bilious vomiting in the first 24 hours of life with abdominal distension in the upper abdomen. Okay, another case. A 2-day-old full-term baby develops distension and has not passed meconium since birth. Abdominal X-ray show largely distended struct loops with absence of air in the rectosigmoid region. What is the next step? So this is a case of what? So we request for barium enema, which reveals gradual narrowing of the sigmoid. This is what we call the anong tawag dito, nimbic appearance. So this is caused by Hirschsprung's disease, which is confirmed by barium enema. So what is Hirschsprung's disease? It is a congenital aganglionic megacolon, developmental disorder of the enteric nervous system, characterized by absence of ganglion cells in the submucosal and the myenteric plexus. It is the most common cause of lower intestinal obstruction in the neonates, with an overall incidence of 1 in 5,000 live births. Male female ratios 4:1 with for short segment disease naman, and approximately 2:1 for total colonic aganglionosis. So Hirschsprung disease is the result of an absence of ganglion cells in the bowel wall extending proximately and continuously from the anus for a variable distance. So the absence of the neural innervation is a consequence of an arrest of neuroblast migration from the proximal to the distal bowel. So without the myenteric and submucosal plexus, there is inadequate relaxation of the bowel wall and the bowel wall hypertonicity, which can lead to intestinal obstruction. So Hirschsprung's disease is usually sporadic, although dominant and recessive patterns of inheritance have been demonstrated in family groups. The agagliotic segment is limited to the rectal sigmoid in 80% of cases. However, approximately 10 to 15% of patients would have long segment disease, defined as disease proximal to the sigmoid colon. While total bowel ganglionosis is rare and accounts for about 5% of cases. Histologically, absence of the Meissner's and the upper back plexuses and hypertrophied nerve bundles with high concentrations of acetylcholinesterase between the the muscular layers and in the submucosa is actually observed in punch biopsy. So this is usually diagnosed in the neonatal period, secondary to distended abdomen, failure to pass meconium in 48 hours, or presence of bilious emesis or aspirates during feeding intolerance. So in 99% of healthy full-term infants, meconium is passed within 48 hours. So in Hirschsprung's disease, this is suspected in any full-term infants with delayed passage of stool. So what happens? Failure to pass stool leads to dilatation of the proximal bowel and abdominal distension. As the bowel dilates, intraluminal pressure increases, resulting in decreased blood flow and deterioration of the mucosal barrier. So stasis allows proliferation of bacteria, which can lead to enterocolitis, and causative agents include Clostridium difficile, Staph aureus, anaerobes, and also coliforms and the anaerobes. So with this is highly associated with diarrhea, abdominal distension, or sepsis, or signs of abdominal obstruction. Red flags in the neonatal period includes a neonatal intestinal obstruction or bowel perforations, delayed passage of meconium with abdominal distension relieved by digital rectal stimulation, or enemas, or chronic severe constipation and enterocolitis. So early recognition before the onset of an enterocolitis is actually essential in reducing morbidity and mortality. So, diba, in our discussion of neck, it is one of condition that can cause neck in the term infants. Now, we differentiate omphalocele versus gastroschisis kasi sila yung most common abdominal wall defects. So, omphalocele is herniation or protrusion of the abdominal contents into the base of the umbilical cord. While gastroschisis naman is para-umbilical abdominal wall defect associated with protrusion of bowels through the defect. So usually on the right side of the umbilical. So these are the common differentiating points between the two. So omphalocele is covered in sac with peritoneum overlying the skin, and insertion of this distal umbilical cord into the sac itself distinguishes this condition from gastroschisis. So herniation of intestines into the cord occurs in approximately 1 in 5,000 of births, with herniation of the liver intestine in 1 in 10,000 of births. This is actually highly associated with the chromosomal abnormalities, about 30%, and in 50 to 70% associated with malformations, other malformations. Survival rate depends on the how large of the abdominal the eviscerated content is actually, and if it's highly associated with a chromosomal or malformations. It's commonly seen in patients with Down syndrome, with Apatow, or Edward syndrome. How about gastroschisis naman? It is rarely associated with genetic condition. Membrane does not cover the bowel exposed in utero and as a result may be matted, dilated, or covered with fibrinous inflammatory rind. So infants with have a higher proportion of uterine growth restrictions. So actually, it can be diagnosed in utero at around 20 weeks, where you see actually free floating bubble loops in the uterine cavity. Okay, the maternal serum alpha-fetoprotein is elevated in pregnancies with gastroschisis, and compared with other abdominal wall defects diagnosed prenatally, such as omphalocele, only 10% of cases with gastroschisis are associated with malformations as outside the GI tract. So incidence is 1 in 4,000 live births, while a small percentage of infants have intestinal atresia or bowel loss and prolonged hospitalizations, the overall survival is greater than 90%. It depends actually if it's more of, if it's institution-based delivery, then they have a good prognosis. Now we go to this morphology. This I think the last part of our lecture. How many minutes? Okay, we can do this in 5 minutes. So it is a study of differences in human forms and mechanism that cause them. So we'll touch on it lang a little kasi it will be discussed in the genetics, I think. It has been estimated in 1 in 40 newborns or 2.5% have a recognizable birth defect or pattern of malformations at birth. And approximately half of these newborns have a single or isolated malformations, whereas the other half have multiple malformations present. From 20 to 30% of infants' deaths and 30 to 15% of deaths after the neonatal period, these are caused by actually congenital abnormalities. So the clinical geneticist attempts to identify the etiology, the mode of inheritance, and the risk that a disorder might occur in the affected child's sibling. So in evaluating children with congenital malformations, the patient's condition may be classified into one of the five different categories. So first, the single gene mutation, which accounts 6% of children with congenital infection. Next would be the chromosomal disorders, which accounts to 7.5%. Then multifactorially inherited conditions, which is the most common, 20%. Then followed by disorders that show unusual pattern of inheritance, which is about 2%, and conditions caused by exposure to teratogen, like congenital infections or exposed to medical causing aberrations, which accounts for 6%. So how do we approach a patient with dysmorphic feature? What is a dysmorphic feature in the first place? It is a difference of a body structure. It can be an isolated finding in an otherwise normal individual, or it can be related to a congenital disorder or a genetic syndrome or a birth defect. So features can vary from isolated to mild to severe congenital infection. So it is important to specifically look for, characterize, and precisely describe and document any major or minor anomalies that may be present in an individual when considering a genetic condition. So first is there's a wide range of phenotypic actually variation. A normal ito yung mga parang variant. A normal spectrum of human variation or morphologic features with no absolute medical significance. So this is observed in more than percent of population. So ito yung mga phenotypically variant, which is normal. While those with minor anomaly naman, they have minor variations of normal morphological features of little or no known medical conditions or surgical or cosmetic significance. It is observed in less than 4%, and these are the common listed minor anomalies. Yung mga simian crease, yung mga excess ear, mga ganun lang. While a major anomaly naman, abnormality that has a medical, surgical, or cosmetic significance. So when do we suspect a congenital or a genetic condition or a syndrome? It is when there is presence of multiple anomalies or more than 3 minor anomalies, or there is more than one major anomaly, so 1 or 2 major anomalies, or there are 2 major anomalies or 1 major anomaly and a few minor anomalies. So you think of you look na for a genetic condition. Okay, that's mga ano naman yung mode of inheritance. So could be variable expression. There's morphologic features may be expressed at different degrees of severity in individuals, resulting in different levels of dysfunction and problems for individuals having the same abnormality, even when due to severe same etiology. So iba-iba yung expression. So each individual with a particular syndrome, sequence, or association will not have every known feature of that disorder. So all the same features as one another, even in the same family. Also, the degree of variable expression may correlate with the degree of pleiotropy in the single gene disorders, as commonly seen in patients with single gene disorder. What about incomplete pedetrans? It is the all or none phenomena, referring to the presence or absence of observable phenotypic expression of features of a dominant disease in an individual doomed to have the mutant allele. While the sex influence naman or limited expression naman, like some congenital anomalies or genetic syndrome due to an autosomal defect are more easily recognized or only recognized in individual of a particular gender. Usually mga autosomal recessive disease, mga sex linked like G6PD. Okay, now we define also this several terms. So congenital birth defects either are isolated or a single defect or manifest as multiple anomalies in a single individual. So single primary defect can be classified according to the nature of the presumed cause of the defect as a malformation, a dysplasia, or a deformation or the disruption, although most of them are malformations. Malformations and dysplasias both affect intrinsic structure. Remember, malformations, dysplasia, intrinsic. A malformation is a primary structural defect arising from a localized error in morphogenesis and resulting in abnormal formation of a tissue or an organ. While dysplasia naman refers to abnormal organization of cells into the tissue. Okay, deformations and disruptions naman are secondary defects result from forces generated extrinsic to the affected tissue or organ. So a deformation is an alteration in the shape or structure of a structure or an organ that has differentiated normally. So while a disruption is a structural defect resulting from destruction of a structure that has formed normally before the onset of the insult. So more than 1,000 of the 1,750 inherited human disorders with altered morphogenesis display multiple malformations. When several malformations occur in a single individual, they are classified as a syndrome, a sequence, or associations. Ito naman yung second mo. First, you define what type, and then you, if there is several malformations, i-define mo naman, is it a syndrome, a sequence, or an association? So syndrome is defined as a pattern of multiple abnormalities that are related by pathophysiology and result from a single defined etiology. Example of this is yung mga chromosomal abnormalities like trisomy 21. While a sequence naman consists of multiple malformations that are caused by a single event that can have many etiologies, such as the Peroban sequence, which is a pattern of multiple anomalies produced by mandibular hypoplasia. While an association naman, on the other hand, it refers to a non-random association or malformations in which there is an unclear and unknown relationship among malformations, such as they do not fit a certain criteria. That's why for a syndrome or for an sequence, that's example of this is actually the Vater association. Now, how do we do assessment? So this is actually the SMARF checklist based on the history and the examination. So you have to have a good history and good comprehensive physical examination to obtain appropriate imaging studies. So the laboratory evaluation of a dysmorph child can be critical to reach or confirm the correct diagnosis. Cytogenetic studies with G-banded chromosome analysis, or what we call the karyotyping, was the gold standard previously performed in the evaluation of a dysmorph patient. So RACGH, and SNP arrays enable copy number variant detection, and in the case of SNP arrays, evaluation of loss of of heterogeneity. So chromosome deletion syndromes will also be identified with specific or sensitive FISH analyses. And these tests are the most sensitive methods for detection of cytogenetic alterations associated with birth defects and multiple congenital anomalies. So ngayon, mas specific na yung nire-request. But you can actually start with basic, which is the chromosomal analysis. Molecular testing for deleterious sequence or variants that cause pleiotropic malformation syndromes is also available for many disorders such as in clinical or research settings. So in most cases, such testing should not be performed indiscriminately. So, but instead should be ordered thoughtfully after the differential diagnosis has been considered. So these are the example of yung mga molecular testing. Okay, how do we manage? Management of the affected patient and genetic counseling are actually essential aspect of the approach to the dysmorph patient. So one of the many benefits of early and accurate diagnosis is that anticipatory guidance and medical monitoring of patients for syndrome-specific medical risk can prolong and improve actually quality of life. So another major benefit of accurate diagnosis is that it provides data for appropriate recurrence risk estimates. So genetic disorders may have direct effect on only one member of the family, but the diagnosis of the condition can actually have an implication for the entire family. So one or both parents may be caregivers or carriers. Siblings may be carriers or may want to know their genetic status when they reach their reproductive years. So recurrence risk provisions is an important component of genetic counseling and should be included in all evaluations for families with birth defects or other inherited disorders. So that would be our last slide, guys. Thank you so much for listening. So there have been an incredible advances in the field of neonatal perinatal medicines in the last few decades. And this include better understanding of the pathophysiology of neonatal disorders, as well as sophisticated technological advances that may permit monitoring, imaging, and support of even the tiniest least mature infant. A good understanding of these diseases consequently enable the clinician to properly address the problems of these newborns. So this ends my lecture on the problematic newborn. Thank you and have a good day. So I leave you with this slide where where the needs of the world and your talents cross, there lies your vacation. Thank you. Any question that you might want to be addressed regarding the lecture? So this is pretty actually Nelson's Bay. So this is I used na the latest edition. I think the 22nd edition. No questions, guys. Thank you and study well for your exam. See you next week for my for my
Thank you, Doc.
Bye.
Thank you po, Doc.
Thank you, Doc.
Thank you, Doc.
Thank you, Doc.